So in the last class, we saw that Stephen's family moved to Dublin, and how Stephen looks for Mercedes, the character from the Count of Monte Cristo. In Dublin, he imagines that he would be able to see her. Then they visit relatives in Dublin, and there is a description of such a visit to one of the relatives' place, where there is a little girl, and the girl looks at Stephen. Stephen came to visit them, therefore, as is customary, young children are asked to perform something. So Stephen is asked to sing a song. After about 2 pages, but when he had sung his song and withdrawn into a snug corner of the room, he began to taste the joy of his loneliness. The mirth which in the beginning of the evening had seemed to him false and trivial was like a soothing air to him, passing gaily by his senses, hiding from other eyes the feverish agitation of his blood, while through the circling of the dancers and amid the music and laughter, her glance travelled to his corner, flattering, taunting, searching, exciting his heart. So this young girl who also came there, she looks at Stephen, and Stephen feels an excitement and agitation as he is under the female gaze. So since Joyce was aware of the Freudian theories and later psychoanalytical theories about gaze, usually the male gaze is more well known, which stands for desire, male desire for the female. Sometimes it stands also for commodification of the female in man's imagination. But here the reverse, the female gaze is described, and this gaze is described as flattering, taunting, searching, and exciting his heart. So obviously Stephen's instincts, his desires are stimulated by the gaze of the girl. And this girl, of course, is Emma Clary. And then we have this description of the leave-taking after the meeting is over, and they take leave of each other. It was the last tram. The lank brown horses knew it and shook their bells to the clear night in admonition. The conductor talked with the driver, both nodding often in the green light of the lamp. On the empty seats of the tram were scattered a few colored tickets. No sound of footsteps came up or down the road. No sound broke the peace of the night, save when the lank brown horses rubbed their noses together and shook their bells. A very realistic description. Now this scene of farewell at the last tram, that this scene is often repeated later also in the novel, which means that this scene created a deep impression on Stephen's psyche. They seemed to listen, he on the upper step and she on the lower. She came up to his step many times and went down to hers again between her phrases, and once or twice stood close beside him for some moments on the upper step, forgetting to go down, and then went down. His heart danced upon her movements like a cork upon a tide. He heard what her eyes said to him from beneath their cowl, and knew that in some dream past, whether in life or in reverie, he had heard their tale before. He saw her urge her vanities, her fine dress, and sash and long black stockings, and knew that he had yielded to them 1,000 times. Therefore, it is clear from this description that the intimate moment at the last tram offered Stephen an opportunity of pursuing his libido, and the girl came up several times to the upper step, and if Stephen wanted, he could have kissed her, but he doesn't kiss her. Instead, he writes a poem on this experience later. But here we see that Stephen looked at the girl and her vanities and her dress, and particular reference to the black stockings, which a psychoanalytic critic analyzed as fetish, sexual fetish of Stephen. You may know the meaning of fetish in psychoanalysis. It means sexual desire for any particular part of the body. So in this case, the legs, or looking at her legs, that indicates, according to psychoanalysis, Stephen's fetish or sexual desire for a part of the body. She too wants me to catch hold of her, he thought. That is why she came with me to the tram. I could easily catch hold of her when she comes up to my step. Nobody is looking. I could hold her and kiss her. So Stephen is a thinker, not a doer. So he doesn't kiss her. Instead, he keeps on thinking about it. But he did neither. And when he was sitting alone in the deserted tram, he tore his ticket into shreds and stared gloomily at the corrugated footboard. And next day he writes a poem. On the first line of the page appeared the title of the verse he was trying to write, To E.C. So here little Stephen is imitating Lord Byron, who has such lyric poems addressed to women, mentioning them only by their initials. So E.C. stands for Emma Clary. He knew it was right to begin so, for he had seen similar titles in the collected poems of Lord Byron. A little below, some undefined sorrow was hidden in the hearts of the protagonists as they stood in silence beneath the leafless trees, and when the moment of farewell had come, the kiss which had been withheld by one was given by both. After this, the letters LDS were written at the foot of the page, and having hidden the book, he went into his mother's bedroom and gazed at his face for a long time in the mirror of a dressing table. So this is a way of Stephen's self-discovery. He is discovering himself as a poet, and in reality he didn't kiss the girl, but in his poem both the protagonists kiss each other. Therefore, according to Freud's theory, it would be called a sublimation of desire. The desire which was not fulfilled in reality finds expression in literature or art and is sublimated. Then there is a cultural program at school, and in that program Stephen performs a dramatic role, and Emma Clary also comes to watch this program with Stephen's father. And this would be a reason for his classmates to tease him, because they noticed that this little girl had come only to watch Stephen's performance. And the boy who teases him is named Heron. And Heron, Stephen wonders, is the name of a bird. He wonders that Heron's name as well as his looks are those of a bird. Heron says, I was just telling my friend Wallace what a lark it would be tonight if you took off the rector in the part of the school matter. Stephen shook his head and smiled in his rival's flushed and mobile face, beaked like a bird's. So Heron was Stephen's rival in class. He had often thought it strange that Vincent Heron had a bird's face as well as a bird's name. Now we know that the bird symbol in this novel is significant, but here the bird symbol appears to be ominous because Heron would be bullying Stephen. "You are a sly dog, Daedalus." "Why so?" said Stephen. "You would think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth," said Heron, "but I am afraid you are a sly dog." "Might I ask you what you are talking about?" said Stephen urbanely. "Indeed you might," answered Heron. "We saw her, Wallis, didn't we? And deucedly pretty she is too, and so inquisitive. And what part does Stephen take, Mr. Daedalus? And will Stephen not sing, Mr. Daedalus? Your governor was staring at her through that eyeglass of his for all he was worth, so that I think the old man has found you out too. I wouldn't care a bit, by Jove. She is ripping, isn't she, Wallis?" So like boys do, they love to tease one another about girls. So Heron says that we have caught you, and this girl was very curious about your performance, and your governor, that is your father, may have also realized that. And for Stephen, this memory of meeting Emma and the farewell at the last tram is like a sacred memory, and he is very agitated that it is spoilt by Heron's attitude. All day he had thought of nothing but the leave-taking on the steps of the tram at Harold's Cross, the stream of moody emotions it had made to course through him, and the poem he had written about it. All day he had imagined a new meeting with her, for he knew that she was to come to the play, and so on and so forth. The growth and knowledge of 2 years of boyhood stood between then and now, forbidding such an outlet, and already the stream of gloomy tenderness within him had started forth and returned upon itself in dark courses and eddies, wearing him in the end until the pleasantry of the prefect and the painted little boy had drawn from him a movement of impatience. And then Heron tells him that you must admit about it, that you are secretly having an affair, and he strikes Stephen with a stick and says, "Admit." Now this is also the trope of admission, confession, which we find throughout this novel. It began with the bald rhyme at the very beginning of the novel, "Apologize, pull out his eyes." So the idea of apologizing, the idea of confessing, later we will have an actual confession. Stephen goes to a father and confesses his sins. Now this confession is a part of Roman Catholic ritual, and it is allied to the idea of sin and punishment. So this motive is further enforced here as Heron bullies Stephen and says, "Admit." "So you may as well admit," Heron went on, "that we have fairly found you out this time. You can't play the saint on me anymore." "Admit," repeated Heron, striking him again with his cane across the calf of the leg. The stroke was playful, but not so lightly given as the first had been. Stephen felt the skin tingle and glow slightly and almost painlessly, and bowing submissively as if to meet his companion's jesting mood, began to recite the Confiteor. The Confiteor, the Latin verse of confession. The episode ended well, for both Heron and Wallis laughed indulgently at the irreverence. Then there are further dialogues with Heron, and these two, Stephen and Heron, they are rivals in the class, and in literature they have different tastes. So Stephen likes Byron, and Heron has a conservative taste, and he likes Tennyson. So Byron was more a kind of a revolutionary poet at that time, and Tennyson was the poet laureate and the official poet of England, so the conservatives would like him. So we see this clash of tastes, and that gives Heron another excuse of bullying Stephen. So in this sequence, the motive of confession is continued. Admit that Byron was no good. No. Admit. No. Admit. No. No. So in this way, Stephen then again repeats the confiteor amid the indulgent laughter of his hearers, and while the scenes of that malignant episode were still passing sharply and swiftly before his mind, he wondered why he bore no malice now to those who had tormented him. He had not forgotten a whit of their cowardice and cruelty, but the memory of it called forth no anger from him. All the descriptions of fierce love and hatred which he had met in books had seemed to him therefore unreal. Even that night, as he stumbled homewards along Jones's Road, he had felt that some power was directing him of that sudden woven anger, as easily as a fruit is divested of its soft, ripe peel. So Stephen felt that even though his friends bullied him, he did not feel any anger for them. And what does this suggest? It suggests that mentally he was more mature than the other boys, and therefore he looked upon the other boys as puerile, and he did not feel anger towards them. So one would feel angry if one attached a lot of importance to honor. But Stephen never felt that his honor was at stake just because he was being bullied. The question of honor here raised was, like all such questions, trivial to him. While his mind had been pursuing its intangible phantoms and turning in irresolution from such pursuit, he had heard about him the constant voices of his father and of his masters, urging him to be a gentleman above all things. So in this paragraph, there is a reference to a great number of voices, that is, different people in Stephen's life. They all have different claims upon him, but Stephen wants to pursue things of the mind, and he is a very private person, and he does not want to attach any importance to the claims made upon him by different people. So his father and his masters, they urged him to be a gentleman and also to be a good Catholic. These voices had now come to be hollow sounding in his ears. When the gymnasium had been opened, he had heard another voice urging him to be strong and manly and healthy. And when the movement towards national revival had begun to be felt in the college, yet another voice had bidden him to be true to his country and help to raise up her fallen language and tradition. So here you see that the urge to be a very healthy person by doing a lot of physical exercise, or the urge to be a good Roman Catholic, or the urge to be a patriot with a nationalistic zeal, participate in the Irish language movement, or the Irish revival, in which Yeats, seeing other Irish writers participated. Joyce never participated in that kind of literary and cultural movement which has only to do with Irish patriotism. On the other hand, he steadily pursued his career in writing in English, and later in this novel, through Stephen, this idea is expressed that an Irishman can take better revenge upon the English by mastering their language better than them and producing great works in that language. In the profane world, as he foresaw, a worldly voice would bid him raise up his father's fallen state by his labors, and meanwhile the voice of his school comrades urged him to be a decent fellow, to shield others from blame or to beg them off, and to do his best to get free days for the school. So the various demands placed upon him by various people, his parents, his schoolmates, his peers, and those who participated in the nationalistic movement. He now remembers the event of his performance in the theatre and how Emma Clary was looking at him. But in this novel, there is no indication when the present situation is being described and when the past is being described like a flashback. So Joyce's technique is very much filmic here. He saw her serious, alluring eyes watching him from among the audience, and their image at once swept away his scruples, leaving his will compact. Another nature seemed to have been lent him. For one rare moment he seemed to be clothed in the real apparel of boyhood. Why real apparel of boyhood? Because he was being urged by the gaze of Emma to be a hero in her eyes, and to Stephen that appears boyish. So obviously there are stages of development in Stephen's psyche, but we do not know, there are no indications by the author when there is a jump in Stephen's psyche, and when he starts looking at the earlier experience as a boyish attitude that he had. So after the performance is over, he left the stage quickly, and he was so agitated and was afraid of meeting Emma right then that he started walking very fast without meeting his father or Emma Clary or those who had come. Without waiting for his father's questions, he ran across the road and began to walk at breakneck speed down the hill. He hardly knew where he was walking. Pride and hope and desire, like crushed herbs in his heart, sent up vapors of maddening incense before the eyes of his mind. So you see, the emotions, they appear to him or in his imagination as different kinds of smell. So with olfactory images, these emotions of pride, hope, desire are described. He strode down the hill amid the tumult of sudden risen vapors of wounded pride and fallen hope and baffled desire. They streamed upwards before his anguished eyes in dense and maddening fumes and passed away above him till at last the air was clear and cold again. A film still veiled his eyes, but they burned no longer. A power akin to that which had often made anger or resentment fall from him brought his steps to rest. So what is this power that prevents him from being angry? So some kind of awareness of his superiority from others, and therefore he stops temporarily being a person moved by desire and instinct, or whatever it is, sex drive, libido, however you call it. If you remember that in the short story Araby also, Joyce describes the young boy being moved by vanity, a desire of buying something from Araby, from the bazaar, and gifting it to a girl. So Joyce is very skilled in describing emotions of a young boy or an adolescent boy. Then he stood still and gazed up at the sombre porch of the morgue, and from that to the dark cobbled laneway at its side. He saw the word "Lots" on the wall of the lane and breathed slowly the rank and heavy air. So he saw on the walls the name Lots written. Now probably it is the name of a prostitute, and in such quarters it is quite likely, beside the morgue and the dark lane, that people who visit prostitutes, they would come there. Now there is this whole area of experience, like in public urinals. People write many things on the wall, and sometimes they write names of the prostitutes they visit or other girls and so on. Sometimes they make obscene drawings, and the 20th century German artist Georg Gross made many famous drawings and paintings based on this fact of people making drawings or writing on the wall of the urinals. So you can see that from a modernist point of view, there is a lot of expansion of the horizon of experience which can be included in arts. And Joyce is almost a pioneer in this. The images of urine, horse dung, and so on and so forth that he uses, these are called scatological images. We find a lot of use of scatological images in the writings of Rabelais, the Renaissance French writer. But after Rabelais, there was no such robust writer who could include these experiences in literature. On the other hand, we know that gradually, from 16th century onwards, perhaps more because of the influence of romantic ideas, that there came to be, there appeared this idea of poetic diction. So in the 18th century, this idea was very forceful, poetic diction. That is, only some words can be used in poetry, and many words were considered too vulgar to be used in poetry. And we know that Wordsworth started rebelling against it. So I'm not sure whether I should blame it to romantics or to Augustine, whatever, but there appeared this notion that literature cannot include all kinds of experience, and there was a lot of censorship against including things which were considered vulgar or scatological. Joyce deliberately breaks this interdiction. Here he includes this. He saw the word Lots on the wall of the lane and breathed slowly the rank and heavy air. That is horse piss and rotted straw. He thought, it is a good odor to breathe. It will calm my heart. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back. So horse piss, horse dung, urine, and so on. In his novel Ulysses also, he includes images like a character passing wind. So these physiological or scatological imagery, which were inconceivable before modernist writings, we can see them in Joyce's writings. Then we see a change of scene, and Stephen was traveling with his father by the night mail to Cork. He knew, however, that his father's property was going to be sold by auction, and in the manner of his own disposition, he felt the world give the lie rudely to his fantasy. So this experience of realizing that his father was becoming financially bankrupt and was forced to sell his property, father and son, they come to Cork, and his father takes him to his school, and there on a desk in a classroom, Stephen notices a word written. The word is fetus. The word fetus, he read the word fetus cut several times in the dark stained wood. And then he realizes that his father or his father's generation, when they were boys, they were just like him or other boys, and not like him, they were like all other normal boys who had always a great libido, a great desire for biological things or sexual things. And that made his father fall farther from his status in Stephen's eyes when he realized that his father was just an ordinary boy like others. So he began to feel more mature than his father. And then his father meets two old friends and drinks with them, and Stephen feels like they were schoolboys. As his father narrates his days of his youth, he becomes very sentimental. His father is by nature sentimental, and he breaks down, and Stephen can hear his father almost sobbing. Stephen heard his father's voice break into a laugh which was almost a sob. He was the handsomest man in Cork at that time. By God, he was. The women used to stand to look after him in the street. Joyce's father's friend says. He heard the sob passing loudly down his father's throat and opened his eyes with a nervous impulse. So this is again an experience where the father figure collapses. According to Lacan, le nom du père, that is the name of the father, which is an idea, and not any real father according to Lacan. The idea that gives authority its power. When people imagine authority to be powerful, that is the name of the father, of which people become afraid, or a child becomes afraid. So that collapses, and that is an inevitable process of growth. Nothing moved him or spoke to him from the real world unless he heard in it an echo of the infuriated cries within him. He could respond to no earthly human appeal, dumb and insensible to the call of summer and gladness and companionship, wearied and dejected by his father's voice. He could scarcely recognize as his own thoughts. So when this image of the father figure collapses, he feels anxious, he feels agonized, and he feels that in his life everything is dreary and there is no scope for friendship, companionship, love, or such other things. So he tries to recall his situation in a funny way. I am Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in the Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon and Stephen and Victoria names. So as we see that the short sentences here, they are all they represent the psyche of a very young person, and an infantile way of attempting to situate oneself in the context of the world. But out of this experience, that is, ultimately Stephen has in his hands nothing but words. So Simon, Stephen, Victoria, these are words, these are names or words. Therefore Stephen's world is made of words. They are the building blocks of his experience. Then he recalls other names, Dante, Parnell, Klein, Broncoes. And he remembers his childhood, his school days, And all this gives an impression of Stephen becoming aware of his growth, because he feels that he is no longer the child of his school days. The three old men we should say, as they drink, Stephen watched the 3 glasses being raised from the counter as his father and his 2 cronies drank to the memory of their past. An abyss of fortune or of temperament sundered him from them. There is a great difference or distance between him and those men. His mind seemed older than theirs. It shone coldly on their stripes and happiness and regrets, like a moon upon a younger earth. No life or youth stirred in him as it had stirred in them. He had known neither the pleasure of companionship with others, nor the vigor of rude male health, nor filial piety. His childhood was dead or lost, and with it his soul capable of simple joys, and he was drifting amid life like the barren shell of the moon. And then there are quotations from Shelley. Art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless? He repeated to himself the lines of Shelley's fragment, its alternation of sad human ineffectualness with vast inhuman cycles of activity chilled him, and he forgot his own human and ineffectual grieving. So, a realistic dialogue between Stephen's father and his friends, rumination or remembrance of their childhood and youth, is followed by Stephen's very mature contemplation that he is very different from them, and this is therefore an indication of his sensibility of an artist. Then we see the description or description of Stephen's family becoming very poor, and Stephen was helping his family with his scholarship money, because his family didn't have even money to buy food. And then Stephen reflects on his vanity of trying to help his family, because that is another claim upon him from which he will ultimately free himself. But at this stage of his development, he tries to help as a young son of the family. He tries to help the family with his scholarship money. How foolish his aim had been! He had tried to build a breakwater of order and elegance against the sordid tide of life without him, and to dam up by rules of conduct and active interest and new filial relations the powerful recurrence of the tides within him. So tide of life without him, that is outside him, which he cannot control. Similarly, the tides within him, that is the passion, desire, drives in him, that also is very powerful. Useless from without as from within, the water had flowed over his barriers. Their tides began once more to jostle fiercely above the crumbled mold. So Stephen finds that it is very difficult to control any of these powerful tides or emotions. He saw clearly too his own futile isolation. He had not gone one step nearer the lives he had sought to approach, nor bridged the restless shame and rancor that divided him from mother and brother and sister. So he feels an alienation from his family. He felt that he was hardly of the one blood with them, but stood to them rather in the mystical kinship of foster child and foster brother. So he feels that there is an inevitable distance between him and the members of his family. Towards the end of this chapter, which we have come to, Stephen more and more begins to roam around the streets of Dublin, and perhaps feeling alienated from his family, he wants to give release to his desires his drives, sexual drives, by going to the prostitute quarters. Now, very often young boys who have an artistic temperament, they often want to experience sex out of a curiosity, because the sexual drive, according to Freud, is sublimated into artistic creation. And that is one reason why we often see in poetry the sexual experience is metamorphosed or expressed in various ways in poetry or art. So this drive, the libido, according to Freud, there is always an excess of this libidinal energy, and this excess energy must find release, and it can find release either in direct sexual experience or in sublimation through artistic and poetic creation. So for artists and poets, it is usual to go for both. So here at the end of the chapter we have a scene where Stephen goes to the prostitute quarters and for the first time meets a prostitute. Now of course at this stage of his life he has no idea about sex. So when he meets the prostitute, she is much older than him, and therefore she has, we may say that she is almost a motherly figure for him, and therefore an Oedipal substitution of his mother, and Stephen breaks down before her and finds himself unable to articulate this experience in language. So the meeting with the prostitute is presented here as a solution to the psychological crisis that was developing. So here Stephen has grown into an adolescent young boy, and the sexual drive, the hormones and other things like his desire of being an artist, which is not yet fully articulated in this chapter. But we have seen that mostly his desire for the other sex, which finds expression through his thoughts about Emma Clary. We saw that Stephen feels this great desire for fulfillment, but he rather opts for sublimating the experience by writing poetry than actually having the experience. He wandered up and down the dark, slimy streets, peering into the gloom of lanes and doorways, listening eagerly for any sound. He moaned to himself like some baffled, prowling beast. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him and to exult with her in sin. He felt some dark presence moving irresistibly upon him from the darkness, a presence subtle and murmurous, and a flood filling him wholly with itself. Its murmur besieged his ears like the murmur of some multitude in sleep. Its subtle streams penetrated his being. His hands clenched convulsively and his teeth set together as he suffered the agony of its penetration. He stretched out his arms in the street to hold fast the frail swooning form that eluded him and incited him, and the cry that he had strangled for so long in his throat issued from his lips. It broke from him like a wail of despair from a hell of sufferers, and died in a wail of furious entreaty, a cry for an iniquitous abandonment, a cry which was but the echo of an obscene scrawl which he had read on the oozing wall of a urinal. So you remember earlier he saw the writing lots on the wall. Before that he saw the writing fetus on the desk, and now he thinks about the writings on the urinal, on the walls of the urinal. So this whole passage, it appears to be an imaginative reconstruction of the process of sexual penetration and ecstasy, sexual ecstasy or orgasm. But curiously, Stephen feels here himself in the position of the female. Why? Because he is talking about his soul, and in his soul, in his imagination, the soul is always female. Now why? Because in Roman Catholic imagination, in Christian imagination, the soul is the bride of Christ. So perhaps Stephen's Roman Catholic bringing up makes him imagine his soul being female, and it is the female soul is penetrated, in its subtle streams penetrated his being, and this image of stretching of arms and the cry coming out, all this is an imagery of sexual orgasm felt by a woman, and this orgasm is very similar to spiritual experience of meeting God. And there is a famous Renaissance sculpture of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, where we see Saint Teresa looking upwards, and from upwards as if a ray of light is coming and entering her, and she is depicted in that sculpture almost like having a physical orgasm. And John Donne also uses the word ecstasy in his poem to suggest that meeting God or being penetrated by God is like, physical orgasm. There are very realistic depictions of clients of the prostitutes having conversation with them or bidding goodbye. Good night, Willie dear, the prostitute says. Her room was warm and lightsome. A huge doll sat with her legs apart in the copious easy chair beside the bed. He tried to bid his tongue speak that he might seem at ease, watching her as she undid her gown, noting the proud conscious movements of her perfumed head. As he stood silent in the middle of the room, she came over to him and embraced him gaily and gravely. Her round arms held him firmly to her, and he, seeing her face lifted to him in serious calm and feeling the warm palm rise and fall of her breast, all but burst into hysterical weeping. Tears of joy and relief shone in his delighted eyes, and his lips parted though they would not speak. She passed her tinkling hand through his hair, calling him a little rascal. Give me a kiss, she said. His lips could not bend to kiss her. He wanted to be held firmly in her arms, to be caressed slowly, slowly, slowly. In her arms he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself, but his lips could not bend to kiss her. So why can't he kiss her? Again we see that some kind of inhibition stopping him. It may be because of his Roman Catholic raising, thus, or it may be more likely the psychoanalytical explanation that the prostitute here replaces the mother figure, and therefore the desire for the mother is always accompanied by the inhibition that society imposes upon this sex by calling it a taboo. So that may be the reason why Stephen cannot kiss the prostitute. With a sudden movement, she bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, as though they were the vehicle of a vague speech. So, according to Lacan, an experience can be articulated in language only when it is fully mastered. But Stephen has not yet mastered this experience, and therefore it is a vague speech. He cannot articulate it. And between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the soon of sin, softer than sound or odor. So, tactile, olfactory, auditory, all senses are synesthetically merged in this experience for Stephen. And if we follow what Joyce called an epiphany in the earlier draft of the novel, that is Stephen Hero, then we would say that this is another epiphany in this novel, and Stephen does not have control over this experience. So since he has not mastered this experience, therefore from Lacanian point of view, this experience has not yet entered into the symbolic order. That is, it cannot be expressed through language. Alright. So this is a moment of revelation, a new knowledge comes to Stephen, as well as a moment of psychical development. And the image of the prostitute here is a nursing image. So once again, according to Jungian interpretation, the mother archetype often finds expression through a nursing image, and sometimes through the image of the water. So the earlier chapter, you remember, ended with the image of the fountain, overflowing fountain, and water drops falling drop by drop. Here, this chapter ends with the image of the nursing prostitute. And thus, the psychical crisis that was developing in this chapter is resolved at the end of the chapter. Alright, so I will stop here. If you have any question, you can ask.